what I'm going to say really doesn't impinge on the solutions and the analysis that's been given. It's another different way of looking at the same problem. And what I've named my talk is why government will not resolve the housing unaffordability, no matter what it does. The problem government faces is twofold. Land is increasingly unaffordable, while wages are almost stagnant. Some years ago, this tendency was highlighted by an advertisement. I think it was by the ANZ, and it depicted a man who was leaving his home on his way to work. A voice says something like, "Do you know that your house will earn more today than you will?" In the last 20 years, Sydney prices, and of course I'm just going over what has been said, have increased fivefold while income has not quite doubled. Put another way, 20 years ago, the average Sydney house was 5.6 times average wages. It's now 14 times the average wage. This being the case, it's no wonder that people predict that the dream of owning a home is over. But what does the teaching of Henry George suggest is the reason for this? In one sense, it's quite natural for land values to grow. Population and improvements are bringing added benefits to land, and land value is simply a measure of those benefits. That is really to say that it's not land that is valuable, it's location. Land value is location value, and this vast association that we call society is the cause. Now, there's obstacles to owning a home, and the primary obstacle to owning a home is our institution of private property in land, which causes and accelerates a growth in land prices. That is, it causes land price and it accelerates it. As a result, a whole succession of obstacles are put in the way of the homeowner or home buyer. Land price is the capitalised or selling price of land. Land price is not land value. It is the selling price of land value. That selling price is many times the annual land value. That's a formidable obstacle, but it brings other obstacles in its way as well. We have a selling price in a normally rising market, and so enters the pure investor. That is, an investor whose quite reasonable aim is to buy and sell paper titles in land. This kind of investor competes with home buyers, and as the price rises, they increase in number, and they tend to outcompete home buyers for houses. So that's the second obstacle. But the main one being land price itself, which flows quite naturally out of the private property in land. The second obstacle I've mentioned is competition from investors, or more precisely, competition from what I've called the pure investor, whose only interest is buying and selling paper titles to land. The third obstacle follows from that. The sensible investor will often find it profitable and less time-consuming simply to leave land as he finds it, vacant or neglected, and wait for it to ripen. Nothing in our society at present is sufficient to deter him. With this competition from pure investors, land scarcity is then inevitable for the home buyer. But scarcity can often get worse as landowners, seeing the rising price, tend to hold on to their land. They too want it to ripen. Now we see demand act in a peculiar way. Growing demand actually produces not greater supply, but greater scarcity. This artificial scarcity is the third obstacle that rises from the existence of a selling price for land. A fourth obstacle is mortgages and interest rates. The selling price produces debts to banks. Remember, the selling price is many times the annual land value. The selling price produces debts to banks that otherwise might be a periodic payment, made during the year for location, rather similar to what our rates used to be in the past, now becomes a hefty mortgage. As we've seen, it is made greater by scarcity price for land. Periodically, speculation exacerbates this scarcity price. The demand for loans increases interest rates. Governments also normally try to constrain speculative prices by raising interest rates. We saw this in the period 1985 to 89. That tends to make mortgages even more expensive. Mortgages and rising interest rates is a fourth obstacle to those wanting to enter the land market. Remember that it too is a result of the selling price of land. Unemployment and low wages follow as another obstacle. Viewed more widely, the chronic undersupply of land gives the appearance of the oversupply of labour. The chronic undersupply of land gives the appearance of the oversupply of labour. Those who want workers have then a bargaining advantage over those who want work. Wages are held down. Another obstacle arises, which is taxation and then privatisation. The private ownership of land that produces a selling price for land also produces a necessity of taxation. Government impoverishment from stagnant wages then produces the sale of roads and other public utilities. The extra expense of common services is the result and is a further strain on household savings. It is natural then for households to try to maintain their standard of living by adding to their woes the encumbrance of private debt. The fact that interest rates are now rather low may be a sign of how the Reserve Bank really views the level of debt in Australia. To sum up what has so far been said, many obstacles that stand in the way of path of those who want to own a home stem from one obstacle, the selling price of land. Land price is your enemy. It grossly inflates land value, it gives an income to those who didn't produce it, and it takes income from those who did earn it. The single tax solution is to turn land value into taxation, and if land values are taken by the government, landowners have nothing to sell. That is what is simply left is land value. To take the value of land from the owners has never been an easy task. It has been and it will be seen as a confiscation of wealth. Yet the selling price of land only occurs because at some time in history, what was really common property was converted into private property. What the single tax does is to restore these incomes to their proper sources. Like all great issues, the land question is an ethical issue. The reality is that the ethical issue is more simple than the fiscal issue. Yet many who urge land value taxation consider the ethical side only as a spin-off, only as a further reason to accept a little land value taxation. As Proudhon said, property is theft. But to put the matter that way is to accuse people. There is another way to put it. By an ethical treatment of rent, Henry George shows how equal rights in land may be achieved. A great and intractable problem is overcome. Unequal rights in land to Henry George was the great and intractable problem of Western civilisation. A great and intractable problem is overcome, and large benefits accrue to a society courageous enough to act morally. Worsening housing unaffordability for both renters and home buyers is the most conspicuous sign of increasing social inequality. But like food and clothing, shelter is a necessity. Thus, government has a problem. If it seriously addresses the problem, government will attack the largest and the most widely spread investment in Australia. That attack could very well bring a rapid deflation of this market, and then the problem is much worse. The sudden drop in land prices will leave debts everywhere and play havoc with the financial system. On the other hand, not to resolve the land problem will end the Australian dream for most and force Australians into cramped and more expensive spaces. And in fact, the Committee for Economic Development, CEDA, is predicting that in future most people will live in apartments and will often be renting. We might also predict that dwellings might have to be built more cheaply to accommodate them. Getting round the horns of this dilemma presents a formidable problem. To solve it, we need to see that it's not a problem for government, it's a problem for society. We expect government to solve what we call the housing problem, but we also accept private property in land. Thus, we expect government to solve this problem without attacking this institution. Government tries to do this, and its solutions do accommodate private property in land, but then its solutions are weak and ineffectual. Housing, so-called, is not a political problem, it's a social problem. To solve it, society must become more acquainted with the ways of solving it. First, it would help if we see the problem is not land, is not housing, but land. Next, it's fundamental to the solution to see that the problem is not a fiscal problem, it's a moral problem. And so the answer is assertion of rights. There are two sets of rights involved. Do I have enough time? Yeah, of course you do. Okay. There are two sets of rights involved. The fundamental one is the equal right to use land. The means to that end is the right of the community to collect what it produces, the value of locations. That is achieved by what is called the single tax. A little land value taxation will not do, though this is all we can expect. Those who hold a monopoly of anything don't mind a little tax, so long as, in return, they have the security in what they own. Land value taxation acknowledges this, that is, that land value is private property. As Paul Keating said many years ago, land value taxation is a wealth tax. And better than other monopolies, a little land value capture by land value taxation is actually often good for land values. Besides properly identify the problem as land price, the public also needs to see that housing is not just a question of supply and demand, like food and clothing. The land market, as we've seen, is quite dysfunctional. Those who already urge land value taxation should consider whether an ethical approach to the question might not be better than a fiscal approach. That means a change of emphasis. The fiscal approach used need not be abandoned, for the single tax has large social benefits. However, while it is true that a small fiscal step is ineffectual to achieving anything, it is not necessary to oppose to the problem the sudden large step of implementing a substantial land value tax. That's bound to cause alarm. So what is the future? It is not an accident that Henry George was a world figure in the 1980s and 1990s, but is now forgotten. As Professor Gaffney said in The Corruption of Economics, how he has argued, when George became a public figure and when he became a candidate for one of the highest offices in the nation, that is the Mayor of New York, he became the wealthiest men in the United States united to take steps to ensure that his teachings were driven out of the profession of economics, and that is still the case. There's another obstacle to addressing the problem. Those who put their savings into land are most often also the articulate and policy-making class. This class vaguely recognises the problem and is sympathetic, but they are unlikely to risk doing anything really about it. Politicians who are also property owners shrewdly know that ordinary Australians unable to own a home will adjust. They always do. As always, public education redounds upon us as citizens. It is reasonable to expect that education into the ethics of the housing question may help form public opinion that favours giving to the community what it owns and thus enabling them to keep what they own, their own wages. The good thing about the advance of public opinion that seriously questions the ethics of speculation and more fundamentally seriously questions land price is that the selling price of land may fall. After all, it is the rising land price that is driving speculation. A decline of speculation also means a decline in land price. CEDA speaks quite rightly about the need to release more land. Falling land prices may well be the lever that releases more land for genuine home buyers. Yet it is true that now there does not appear to be the likelihood of serious thought in Australia being given to the basis of the housing problem. CEDA also said that any improvement may take 40 years. When one looks at the present tendencies, that forecast might be optimistic. Thank you.
Well done. Well done. Well done.